And yet when the history of this country is written, when a final accounting is done, it is this small, quiet woman whose name will be remembered. Long after the names of senators and presidents have been forgotten, it's her name that will be recalled as having helped lay the foundation for a nation to live up to its creed.
Rosa Parks took a stand in 1955 by sitting down. That part of her story is well known, but her work after that day is not. Rosa Parks did not stop taking a stand after she was arrested on that Montgomery bus in 1955. She marched in Washington, led protests against apartheid, but by 1984 her image was forgotten. What wasn't forgotten is what she stood up to and the nonviolent change she continues to inspire. Rosa Louise McCauley was born on February 4, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. At age 11, her family went to live with relatives in Montgomery, Alabama, to attend the Montgomery School for Girls, a school started by white Northern teachers who helped poor black girls. At age 16, she dropped out of school to take care of her ill grandmother. Once married, her husband Raymond Parks insisted she go back to school, and in 1934, she received her high school diploma. Years later, Rosa volunteered and served as a secretary for NAACP for E.D. Nixon for 12 years. She helped find lawyers for black people accused of crimes they did not commit and helped blacks become registered voters.
KKK moved through the country, burning Negro churches, schools, flogging, and killing. Grandfather stayed up to wait for them to come to our house. He kept his shotgun within hand reach at all times. We could not undress and go to bed at night. The doors and windows were boarded and nailed tight from the inside. I stayed awake many nights keeping vigil with Grandpa.
Rosa Parks was not like most little girls. She had a strong opinion about what was fair. Rosa's childhood was strongly impacted by the Jim Crow laws, which allowed segregation in America.
One day, when I was about 10, I met a little white boy named Franklin on the road. He was about my size, maybe a little bit larger. He said something to me, and he threatened to hit me, balled up his fist as if to give me a sock. I picked up a brick and dared him to hit me. He thought better of the idea and went away. She wrote in her autobiography, this type of little girl was bound to continue to fight for change in her later years.
By the time she reached high school, Parks was a voracious reader. The books she read led her to understand the realities and cruelty of racism. She read William Gallo Shell's Is the Negro a Beast?, where the author claims that African Americans are less than human according to the Bible and science.
When I learned that we, my family, were Negroes, it caused me to think that throughout my life I'd have to prove myself as something other than a beast.
The experience explains her lifelong fight for equal rights and justice. As an adult, Rosa lived under the Jim Crow laws, which treated African Americans as second-class citizens. These laws were created by white members of mostly the southern states beginning in the 1870s after failure of Reconstruction segregation between blacks and whites suddenly became the law. These laws are named after a performance by Thomas Rice, a popular song and dance act modeled after a slave whose name was Jim Crow. The play fueled the belief that blacks were less than human. On the day Rosa Parks challenged the bus driver, she was challenging the idea of Jim Crow. That was true in 1955, and it stayed true for the rest of her life. That fight to resist made history, but her courage to take stands continued.
If I did not resist being mistreated, she once told journalist Studs Terkel, I would spend the rest of my life being mistreated.
Rosa became the face of the civil rights movement, but she suffered from taking that stand. She and her husband Raymond were concerned for their safety in Alabama. Death threats were common. The threats were so bad, her husband slept with a gun, just like her grandfather did when she was a child. Sometimes Rosa's close friend Bertha Butler would call just to block up the phone line from all those haters' calls. Because of her stand, she lost her seamstress job at Montgomery Fair department store, and her husband was also fired from his job as a barber. But in 1957, she moved north to Detroit, Michigan, and was hired by U.S. Representative John Conyers' congressional office. On August 28, 1963, Parks marched on Washington for jobs and freedom. She was part of the 250,000 protesters who attended. It was one of the largest marches ever seen in our nation's capital and was one of the first to have any television coverage. However, few know of her participation. The reason is not because she is black. The reason is because of her gender. Women marchers were sidelined from the media and cameras and sent to Independence Avenue. The media greeted the male marchers who were on Pennsylvania Avenue. By the 1980s, many Americans forgot about Rosa Parks, but they didn't forget the stand she took in 1955. This 1980s television show, To Tell the Truth, is an example of how many Americans remember her impact, but forgot the
get
woman.
Their names before the public and remember. But Miss Rosa Parks is 10 foot tall, and she's a legend and a hero in the democracy of the United States, not just among black people.
And now we're going to find out which of these ladies really is the incredible Rosa Parks. Will the real Rosa Parks please stand up?
In 1984, Parks returned to Washington, D.C. to protest against apartheid, a government-sponsored form of segregation in South Africa. She protested at the South African embassy. I plan not to give up until all are free, Parks told the crowd. She also stated, I have learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear. In 2001, Parks was still living in Detroit and was on the brink of eviction from the apartment where she spent the last years of her life. A local church collected money to help her pay her rent. Meanwhile, the bus she took a stand on was sold for almost $500,000 to the Ford Museum in Detroit. Parks died in poverty just 4 years later in 2005. She was 92 years old. Her funeral lasted 7 hours, and her casket was transported by bus to the Capitol's Rotunda for a memorial service, an honor reserved until then exclusively for elected officials. There were moving tributes and plenty of references to her soft-spoken strength on that December day in Alabama. It took a game show to remind us not to forget her. It took a future president to remind us not to forget her impact. The fact that one woman inspired a movement and changed a nation will continue to inspire nonviolent protests as long as we don't forget.